Hello everyone. My name is April Nelson. I am a registered psychologist and I am the author of the Sensory Compounding Workbook. Thank you for coming today. We're going to talk in a little detail about the Sensory Compounding Workbook and how it came about in terms of me developing it and how that integrates with my practice of psychology. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the brain and some sensory experiences that some of my clients have had that basically led me to creating this style of tool for some people. So let's start off with the definition of psychology. So the study of psychology is basically the study of the mind. And I actually like Wikipedia's definition because it encourages the aspects of the conscious and the unconscious experiences. This really is a great connection between when we look at integrative health practice. So when I'm talking about integrative health practice, I'm talking about people that provide massage therapy or sound therapy or art therapy or Reiki practice, that type of stuff. And you'll see when I start talking a little bit more about sensory compounding in more detail, you're going to see that there is a connection between the two. So defining psychology. So psychology is the study of behavior and mind that embraces all aspects of the conscious and the unconscious experiences. So I just wanted to mention as well that I'm a member of the Canadian Federation of Clinical Hypnosis, and I'm trained in cognitive hypnotherapy, and surprisingly there are a large number of regulated professionals like psychiatrists, physicians, psychologists that are also practicing this type of therapy, the cognitive hypnotherapy in the healthcare system. And I'm quite supportive of this because I've seen that there's a positive effects of using cognitive hypnotherapy on pain management. And the reason I talk a little bit about this is because within the Sensory Compounding Workbook, there is an element of meditation that the individual is encouraged to partake in. So there is a safe place exercise. It's almost bordering on self-hypnosis, where a person will take themselves into a place of comfort and peace and create a safe place. And what we do is we look at how the sensory aspects can be pulled out of that experience and brought into more of a compounding aspect. But I'll talk a little bit more about that. So I want to talk a little bit about the brain as well, because this is very, very important when I'm talking about sensory work. So with the brain, and as a psychologist, as I've mentioned, we study the brain. But I've also mentioned that my area of focus is with the sensory piece around stress. Previously, I've worked in the healthcare system in mental health for about 10 years, and our focus was on crisis stabilization and learning or teaching people how to manage the stress response. And that's a huge piece of connecting with the sensory aspect and learning to manage that, what we call fight or flight response. And when I talk about the fight or flight response or the stress response, that's where our mind and our body go into a type of protection mode, and we sense that fear. We start to prepare for fight or flight, and there's a lot of changes that happen in our body. We start to sweat, our heart beats faster, our muscles tense, and we actually conserve energy for the situation, and that's where the amygdala comes in. And So, you can ask, how does the amygdala and hippocampus play a role in all of this? Well, when you think of amygdala, there's the word that comes in, which is fear. And all of us are experiencing that right now, to be honest, with what's happening in the world. The amygdala is the reason that we're afraid of things outside of our control. It also controls the way we react to certain stimuli or an event that causes an emotion that we see as potentially threatening or dangerous. So in essence, this is a protective factor that keeps us on our toes if there's anything that's potentially dangerous and outside of our control. It controls our reactions, causing an emotion, thus impacting the sensory system. The amygdala also receives numerous connections from the hippocampus. And so the hippocampus is involved in storing these memories and may be the origin of storing strong emotions that are triggered by particular memories and thus provoking anxiety. So since the hippocampus is involved in storing and retrieving explicit memories, its connection to the amygdala may be the origin of strong emotions triggered by particular memories. The hippocampus also specializes in processing sets of stimuli as opposed to individual stimuli. In other words, the context of a situation. So hence it is because of the hippocampus and its close connections with the amygdala that the entire context associated with a stressful event can definitely provoke anxiety. So let's look at a situation to put this into perspective. And the example is, we'll talk about a car accident. So the amygdala and the hippocampus work in parallel. The hippocampus will remember who you were with, what you did, and the fact that it was particularly painful. So when you remember the event, it is the amygdala that will make your palms sweat, your heart race, and your muscles tense. This helps me understand how the brain and the body are connected so that we can create a tool that's going to help target both so that positive change can be supported. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about sensory compounding. So as I mentioned, the sensory information comes into the amygdala either through the sensory thalamus or the various sensory cortexes. Now, when I talk about the sensory cortexes, I'm going to talk about each of the senses. So what I mean by that is the visual cortex is our sight. The olfactory cortex is our smell. The auditory cortex is our hearing. The somatosensory cortex is touch. And the gustatory cortex, of course, is taste. Okay? So do you remember when I said that the amygdala is almost like our protective factor, sending signals to our brain about the danger, so it's receiving sensory information to be able to do this? Sensory information comes to the amygdala through our sensory thalamus or various sensory cortexes that I just mentioned. So this is really important. So, you probably heard before that our body stores emotions. Well, there is truth in that. When we think about the sensory nervous system, it's attached to the brain, so the sensory does process. So recognizing the connection is almost wanting to, recognizing this connection is making us think that we almost want to rewire what we've learned. Because there, in many cases, when we've experienced a stressful event, it is quite negative. It creates a negative response. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the senses, and I've identified, and you can see that here on slide 9. So we have, so what I've done is I've created little icons for each sense. So the senses connect you to the world. Each sense organ takes in physical information from the environment and then sends it to the brain for processing. So in the workbook, what I've done is I've taken you through each of the senses and provided more detail in terms of how each sense works. And I challenge you in this workbook to focus have a mindful focus on each sense. And then when we work towards sensory compounding, the next step is putting all those senses together so that we can create a positive response. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we work through this PowerPoint. So as I mentioned, the workbook takes you through each of the senses, providing you with factual information regarding each sense and how it impacts you in your learning. It then takes you through some grounding exercises just to get you more in tune with each sense. Now, when I started my journey, I wanted to look at the whole person. And this particularly happened and triggered me was when my mom passed. And on the urging of a colleague, she wanted me to attend a massage therapy studio. So and that was a difficult time, you know, when people have experienced any type of stressful event. And in my case, that was a sense of loss. You just don't feel like you're grounded or you're in a place. It's almost like you remove yourself from your body. But the interesting thing was that when I would sit in the waiting room, I believe that subconsciously my body was taking all this sensory information. But my brain wasn't in that place to process it. So basically, I was not grounded, able to understand or how to treat myself. My brain and my body were not connected at that time. But what was really interesting over this period of time attending massage therapy sessions, I realized that my body ended up relaxing all on its own when I would enter the massage studio, and realizing that for myself, after a few sessions, I realized that, wow, I just experienced a conditioned response. This was not intentional, it just happened. And that was the really cool thing. That was then when I decided I wanted to create something that would target all the senses and create a stronger learned response. So that's when I incorporated the idea of compounding, using one or more, well, basically more than one sense at a time. And that's where the whole concept of sensory compounding came about. And as I had mentioned earlier in this PowerPoint, I talked a bit about mindfulness meditation. And there are some research studies that have shown that mindfulness meditation has improved the regulation of the stress hormone cortisol, resulting in improved stress management and the ability of the individual reaching a sense of inner peace and calm. And that's what I've incorporated into this this workbook. Was there is an element of using a type of mindfulness meditation. And as I mentioned, of course, I'm trained in cognitive hypnotherapy, so I wanted to be able to, how can this mindful meditation put you into a state of your own self-hypnosis. And in many cases it actually does, depending upon what you're listening to. So I've included in my PowerPoint here some research information, so if you wanted to check that out in terms of the mindfulness meditation. I wanted to also talk a little bit about color therapy, and there's a nice little saying there from Pablo Picasso who says, "Colors like features follow the changes of emotions," and how true it is. How many times, we dress to our emotions. If we're feeling quite depressed, we can wear those darker colors, or if we feel quite bright and happy, we tend to have some of those brighter colors like yellow or red. Some studies have identified that colors are rich with symbolism, and that symbolism is based on the perception of how one associates colors with things, experiences, and preference, or even objects. Understanding behavior through colors was developed by Carl Jung. Now, he was a well-known psychiatrist and founder of the analytical psychology, and he was quoted as saying, "Colors are the mother tongue of the subconscious. So many of his studies led him to explore alternative measures to try and explain human behavior through the use of color. The path of exploring the impact of colors on personality development led him to create art therapy. And he believed that this was an effective medium to work through any type of trauma or distress. So color is a part of our everyday lives. We cannot escape it, and it's recognizing that colors have a strong impact on our emotions and feelings that are essential and important to us. And as I'd mentioned, what are you wearing on a certain day? Are you feeling sad or happy? And colors certainly dictate that for us. And the reason I mentioned color in my presentation is in the Sensory Compounding Workbook, when we go through, we actually have that meditation around creating a safe place. I ask you to draw it, and I ask you to create it. However you want to create it, with different colors, with collage, however, but to reinforce that idea of a safe place, which is really quite exciting. So here's some research information there as well that I've included in the PowerPoint around color therapy. So I'm going to talk about somatosensory, so the touch. So touch, basically, our somatosensory cortex. So fMRI studies show that the sensation of touch has a wide impact on the brain, influencing our sensations, our movements, our thought process, and our capacity to learn new movements. So I read an article that was written by this lady named Shannon Cicero, and it was titled "The Sense of Touch." And this article articulated beautifully the impact of touch during everyday interactions and provided an incredible depiction of the full expanse of touch on movement and from moment to moment. So if we can, just for a moment, I'd like you to visualize this and visualize the touch aspect. And I'm going to just basically read to you just a passage on touch. And if you could, at this time, just to close your eyes. And I want you to visualize this in your mind. So after a long day at work, you walk through the door and slip off those toe-pinching, heel-blistering shoes. You quickly give yourself the therapeutic rub down and into some warm, fuzzy socks. You give your dog a quick pat, grab a soft pillow, and finally flop down on the couch. About the time you get into a comfortable position, you realize that you set your drink a bit too far away on the table. This isn't a problem, though. While you focus your attention on the TV screen, you reach over and feel around for your hot cup of tea. Once your hand hits the hot ceramic mug, you realize that you're home. No more than 15 minutes had passed since you walked through the door, but your sense of touch has gathered millions of bits of information from your surroundings. The pain from the pair of shoes is gone. A soft, fluffy comfort has taken over. A cold, wet kiss from your dog has given way to the warm comfort of the couch and a cup of hot tea. From temperature to texture, your state of touch has been in constant communication with your brain. Great. So, according to Young, when someone touches you, receptors in the skin and or the muscles transmit a signal via the spinal cord and medulla to this area of your brain. This corresponds to an increase in the activity of the neurons in this area, so the area where you've been touched. So what about smell? So the olfactory cortex. Have you ever experienced a time when a certain smell triggered a memory? Did you feel like you were temporarily transported to that place and time in that moment? In a comparison study involving one study from Britain in 1966 and another study conducted in the US by Kane and Johnson, the scent of wintergreen was used in both studies. In the British study, the wintergreen scent was given the lowest pleasantness rating, whereas the study in the United States identified the wintergreen scent as the most pleasant. The reason for this difference was explained that the scent of wintergreen was associated with medicine and was particularly used for analgesics, so drugs to relieve pain that were popular in World War II. So the scent of wintergreen in the US was exclusively a candy mint smell and had a positive connotation. Neuroanatomy further supports the proposition that our olfactory system, the orbitofrontal cortex, in addition to the processing olfaction, is the area of the brain critical for assigning affective value to stimuli. So in other words, assigning hedonic meaning. Furthermore, the amygdala, which synapses directly with the olfactory nerve, is critical for the emotional associative learning. So one fragrance, two different reactions. So the olfactory system assigned value to the stimuli, so the wintergreen smell, based on the experience, and the amygdala received this information, creating the emotion related to this experience. So remember, to the hippocampus, the memory that's attached to it. And we talked about that at the beginning. And I've included some research around that as well, which you can see on slide number 17. All right. So, just an overview in terms of sensory compounding. So when I wanted to develop sensory compounding, I basically based it on conditioning theory. So conditioning means learning. And learning to use all 5 of your senses to create and trigger a peaceful, calm reaction. That's the compounding piece. So conditioning is when we learn to associate a sense with an event, person, place, etc. If it's a happy association, then we experience the sense as happiness. We will experience this positive reaction. When it's a negative association, we'll experience a negative association. And that's the element around conditioning. And as I've mentioned, compounding. So there are many methods out there to just use one sense to create a positive response. So we hear about aromatherapy as one, art therapy is another. And what makes sensory compounding very unique is that this workbook teaches you to actually learn how to combine and compound all senses to create a very powerful stimulus for relaxation and inner peace. So a big part of dealing with stress is learning what sensory triggers are associated with that experience, so that trigger that you had, and basically reprogramming them so that they don't trigger you anymore. So sensory compounding can actually help you learn new responses to established sensory triggers. You can also learn new ways to use your senses to create pleasant responses such as calmness, peace, and relaxation. So really, when we think about the whole idea of sensory compounding, it's really nothing new, because in essence we're doing that all the time. We are really conditioning ourselves, but we look at it more of that from that negative aspect, right? When we experience things out there that have been a negative experience. Basically, sensory compounding is becoming very intentional about creating a positive experience. So that's just a bit of an overview in terms of my idea around sensory compounding and creating this sensory compounding workbook. Thank you for your time today, and please, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to visit my website at sensorycompoundingworkbook.com. I also have a blog that I'm writing on the website. The workbook is available through Balboa Press, and it's both paperback and ebook. And I've left the link in the slide for you if you're interested. And again, thank you for this opportunity to tell you a little bit about my creation, and I wish you all the best in the future. Take care. Bye-bye.